In 1887, society operated on a simple principle. Some people were meant to be seen, and others were meant to remain invisible. Edward Sinclair, Duke of Harrington, was precisely the sort of man society had been designed to see. His title was ancient, his fortune was substantial, his reputation was impeccable. He attended Parliament when duty required. He dined with families whose names appeared in history books. He conducted himself with a restraint that society had learned to admire and, more importantly, to trust. At 32, unmarried, he was viewed not as a problem, but as a man who understood the value of patience. Society would wait for the Duke of Harrington to marry. It had nothing but time. Eleanor Hartwell understood invisibility in the way only those born to service could. She had worked in great houses since she was 14 years old, had learned to move through corridors without being noticed, to set down teacups without drawing attention, to maintain the smooth functioning of a household while remaining entirely peripheral. She was competent, she was trustworthy, she was, most importantly, unremarkable. This was not a failure. This was the foundation of her survival. No one questioned why a duke would speak to a housemaid only when necessary. No one observed that certain evenings, when the household had settled into sleep, the duke's footsteps led away from his chambers toward the servants' quarters. No one noticed that Eleanor stood a fraction longer when he passed, or that once, only once, their hands had touched while exchanging a teacup, and neither had pulled away. Society did not see what it did not wish to see, and what it did not see, it could not judge. For 8 months they had existed in this carefully calibrated silence, sharing a secret that would turn their lives around. Silence, like all things built on subterfuge, does not remain invisible forever. Silence has a presence. It accumulates. It becomes visible in the small gestures that last a moment too long, the glances that carry weight, the patterns that emerge when someone is paying close enough attention. And someone was paying attention. What happens when silence becomes dangerous? When the person you love most requires you to choose between protecting them and claiming them. When the world demands you decide, once and for all, what love means and what you are willing to sacrifice. This is the story of a duke and a maid who believed they could love in secret. Before we continue, tell me where you are listening from and what hour of day has brought you here. I read every comment, and I care about where these stories find their audience. Now, let us begin. Let us go back to 1887, to a house in London where secrets are about to become impossible to keep, where a woman is about to decide that invisibility is too high a price to pay, and where a duke will finally have to choose what matters more, his title or his love. This is the story of what happens when silence stops being a sanctuary and becomes a prison. The house on Belgrave Square was precisely what a duke's residence ought to be: grand without ostentation, elegant without excess, the kind of place that suggested old money, old families, old certainties, the kind of place where everything was exactly as it should be, precisely because no one was permitted to question it. Eleanor had been in the Duke's employ for 3 years, long enough to understand the rhythms of the household, long enough to know which floorboards creaked, which servants could be trusted to remain silent, which corridors were empty at specific hours of the night, long enough to have become so thoroughly invisible that even when she was directly observed, she was somehow still unseen. This invisibility had become their greatest asset and their deepest prison. On this particular evening in early November, the household operated precisely according to schedule. Dinner had been served at 8 o'clock, a quiet affair with only the Duke and his elderly mother, the Dowager Duchess, in attendance. Eleanor had stood behind his chair as she always did, presenting each course with the practiced efficiency of a servant who had performed this duty countless times. Her hands were steady, her expression was neutral. Her proximity to Edward Sinclair meant absolutely nothing to anyone observing. He did not acknowledge her beyond what propriety required. "Miss Hartwell, the wine." "Yes, Your Grace." She poured. She stepped back. She disappeared. By 11 o'clock, the house had settled into the particular silence that came only when the servants had retired and the family had withdrawn to their private chambers. Eleanor sat in her small room at the back of the servants' quarters, a space so modest that it contained only a narrow bed, a single chair, and a washstand. She was still dressed in her day clothes. There was no one to undress for, no one to see her in dishabille. She sat on the edge of her bed and waited. At precisely 11:15, there was a soft knock. Once, twice, the pattern they had established. Eleanor rose and unlocked the door. Edward stepped inside quickly, closing it behind him with the care of a man who understood that discovery meant ruin. He was still in his evening clothes, his jacket unbuttoned, his tie loosened. He looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the day's activities and everything to do with the constant effort of pretending. "How are you?" he asked quietly. It was always his first question, as though her well-being mattered more than the scandal that would consume them both if anyone discovered this room, this meeting, this relationship. "Well enough," Eleanor said, and it was mostly true. Mrs. Pemberton was in a mood about the silver. "I spent an hour polishing the candlesticks." Edward moved to the chair and sat, suddenly looking every one of his 32 years. "My mother mentioned you today." Eleanor's pulse quickened. What did she say? That Miss Hartwell had been with us 3 years, that you were competent, that you maintained better standards than the previous housemaid. He looked up at her. There was something in her tone, a sharpness, as though she was testing whether I would react. "Did you?" "No." I responded as one discusses household staff, with appropriate disinterest. He reached for her hand and she took it, their fingers intertwining in the darkness. "But Eleanor, she is beginning to notice things. The way I speak to you, the fact that you have remained in my employ longer than is typical." Him, their shoulders nearly touching but not quite. Even here, even in this private space, they maintained a careful distance. Old habits died hard. "What does she suspect?" "I do not know. But my mother is not a woman who notices things without drawing conclusions." He was quiet for a moment. "She has been mentioning eligible young women with increasing frequency. She attended a tea at Lady Ashworth's last week and came home speaking of Miss Catherine Waverley, accomplished, well-bred, from a suitable family." Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest. "Are you considering—" "No." The word was sharp, absolute. "Eleanor, I married you. Legally. Before God. My feelings have not changed. But your circumstances have," Eleanor said quietly. "Or rather, everyone's expectations of your circumstances are increasing. You cannot remain a bachelor forever." "I know." Edward's grip on her hand tightened. "But I will not marry Catherine Waverley, or any other woman, while I am already married to you. Your mother will never accept this." "I know that as well." Edward stood, moving to the small window that looked out onto the dark garden. "But I cannot lose you, Eleanor. I cannot go back to existing in this house with you as merely a servant, seeing you every day and never being permitted to acknowledge what you mean to me." Eleanor rose and stood beside him, careful not to touch him in case someone might somehow see through the darkness and the walls. "We knew when we married that it would be like this. We agreed that silence was necessary." "We agreed that silence was temporary," Edward corrected. "We told ourselves that we would find another way eventually, that circumstances would change. But Eleanor, it has been 8 months. 8 months of coming to your room like a thief. 8 months of pretending you mean nothing to me. 8 months of watching my mother and society and everyone I know make plans for my life as though I do not already have a wife." Eleanor said nothing because what could she say? He was right. The silence that had seemed bearable in those early months, the novelty of stolen time, the intensity of meeting in darkness, the understanding that they were protecting each other, had begun to feel less like protection and more like erasure. "I love you," Edward said, and his voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with the darkness around them. "I need you to understand that I love you completely, not as a convenience, not as a secret, not as something shameful to be hidden, but as a wife, as an equal, as the woman I have chosen to spend my life with." "I know," Eleanor whispered. "Do you?" He turned to face her, his expression intense in the faint moonlight that filtered through the window. "Because sometimes I wonder if this silence has convinced you otherwise. If being invisible has convinced you that you should be invisible." Eleanor's eyes burned. "It has not convinced me of that, but it has convinced me that you are uncertain, that you are trying to have both, a marriage to me and the life society expects of you, and Eleanor cannot work forever." "Then what do you suggest?" Edward asked, and there was an edge to his voice now. Frustration, fear, the desperation of a man who loved something he could not claim. Eleanor turned away from the window. "I do not know. I only know that 8 months of this has exhausted me, being seen by you and invisible to everyone else, being your wife at night and your servant during the day. I am trying to protect you, Edward said. I know, Eleanor replied. But perhaps I no longer wish to be protected. Perhaps I wish to be acknowledged. The words hung between them in the darkness. They had been unspoken for months, but they had always been there, underneath every stolen kiss, every whispered conversation, every moment they had shared in this small room while the world slept. Edward reached for her, pulling her into his arms. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the rapid beating of his heart. I will find a way, he said into her hair. I swear to you, Eleanor, I will find a way to claim you openly, to make this right. But even as he said it, Eleanor understood that finding a way and actually taking it were two very different things, and time, which they had believed they had in abundance, was beginning to run out. The marriage had not been planned, or rather, it had been planned with the desperation of two people who saw no other way forward, who understood that society would never permit what they felt, and who decided that the law itself would have to serve as their witness. It had begun 6 months earlier, on a spring evening when Eleanor was fetching fresh linens for Edward's chambers. She had been working in the house for nearly 3 years by then, and the invisibility of service had become so complete that she moved through the rooms like a ghost, seen but not observed, present but not acknowledged. Edward had been alone in his chambers that evening. His mother was attending a dinner party. The rest of the household was occupied with their duties. And when Eleanor entered with an armful of clean linens, he had done something he had never done before. He had closed the door behind her. Your Grace? She had asked, her voice steady despite the rapid acceleration of her heartbeat. Eleanor, he had said, using her given name in a way that immediately established the intimacy of what was about to occur. I cannot continue like this. She had set down the linens carefully, buying time, trying to understand what he meant. Like what, sir? Like this, he repeated, gesturing vaguely at the space between them, at the formality that had governed every interaction between them for 3 years. Pretending, maintaining this distance, treating you as though you are merely a servant when you are. He had stopped, seemingly uncertain how to complete the sentence. When I am what? Eleanor had asked quietly. When you are the woman I love, Edward had said simply. When you are the only person in this house who makes me feel as though I exist. When your presence is the only thing that makes my days bearable. Eleanor had stood frozen, the weight of his words settling over her like snow. She had known, of course. She had felt it in the lingering glances, in the way his voice changed when he spoke to her, in the deliberate formality he maintained precisely because the alternative would be exposure. But hearing it stated aloud was different. It made it real in a way that silence had kept it from being. Your Grace, we cannot. I know we cannot, Edward had interrupted. I know society would never permit it. I know my mother would cut me off. I know you would be destroyed if anyone discovered what I feel for you. But Eleanor, I cannot spend the rest of my life pretending to be content with the position society has assigned to me when the one thing I actually desire is standing directly in front of me. What are you asking me? Eleanor had whispered. I am asking if you feel even a fraction of what I feel, if this is not entirely one-sided, if there is any possibility that you might care for me as more than merely an employer. Eleanor had wanted to deny it. She had wanted to insist on propriety, to maintain the careful distance that had protected them both. But the truth had been there in her voice when she spoke. I love you, she had said. I have loved you for longer than I should have. But loving you changes nothing about what we are. It changes everything, Edward had replied. Because if you love me, then I cannot accept a life where I am not permitted to love you back openly. I cannot accept that I must marry some suitable woman while you remain in my house as a servant. I cannot accept that the law and society and convention are permitted to dictate what my heart is allowed to feel. Eleanor had moved to the door, her hand on the knob. Then what do you propose we do? Run away? Destroy your family's standing? Condemn me to a life of complete ruin? I propose that we marry, Edward had said simply. Eleanor had turned back to stare at him. You cannot be serious. I have never been more serious about anything in my life. Edward had crossed the room, standing before her. Not openly, not in society, but legally, before God and witnesses. A marriage that is real and binding, that makes you my wife in fact if not in name, so that when I inevitably must take a wife that society deems appropriate, at least I will know that the marriage that actually matters is the one that already exists. That is not a marriage, Your Grace. That is deception compounded upon deception. It is survival, Edward had replied. It is the only way I can imagine continuing to exist in this house, in this life, knowing that you are here, and that I love you, and that I cannot claim you. If I cannot have you openly, Eleanor, then I will at least have you truly, even in secret. Eleanor had wanted to refuse. She had wanted to maintain her dignity, to walk out of that room and never return. But she had spent her entire life being invisible, and the thought of being truly seen by one person, truly known by one person, even if that knowledge could never be shared with the world, it had been too much to resist. Where? She had asked finally. How? Edward had already thought it through. He had a country chapel in mind, nearly 2 hours from London, in a village so small and unremarkable that no one they knew would ever think to look there. He had a vicar, a distant relation by marriage, who asked no questions and understood that some ceremonies required discretion. He had even acquired a special license, the kind that permitted marriages without the typical announcements and waiting periods. Saturday, he had said, I will tell my mother I am visiting an estate matter. You will tell Mrs. Pemberton you are visiting family. No one will question either story. And then, Eleanor, we marry in secret and return and continue as we were. Nothing changes except that we will be bound by law to a union the world will never acknowledge. And then, Edward had said, taking her hand gently, everything changes because we will know the truth. You will know that you are not merely a servant, that you are my wife, that you have a claim upon me that no one can dispute, even if no one ever knows it exists. The chapel had been small, exactly as Edward had described. Medieval stone, narrow windows, the kind of place that had stood for centuries bearing witness to quiet moments that society preferred to forget. The vicar had been elderly, his hands unsteady as he opened his prayer book, his eyes carefully averted from Eleanor's face, as though not seeing her might preserve his plausible deniability. I trust this is a matter of necessity, the vicar had said, not quite meeting Edward's gaze. It is a matter of the utmost importance, Edward had replied, which was not precisely an answer but seemed to satisfy the old man. There had been 2 witnesses, the vicar's wife, a woman of perhaps 70 who had knitted throughout the ceremony without looking up once, and a farmer who had been passing by and had been offered a coin to serve the legal requirement. No one who would speak of this, no one who would remember them beyond the moment. Eleanor had worn a simple grey dress, her best dress, but simple nonetheless, because anything more would have drawn attention. Edward had worn his usual clothes, though he had brought a ring, a band of gold so plain it could have belonged to anyone. With this ring, he had said, sliding it onto her finger, I thee wed. The words had been traditional. The moment had been entirely extraordinary. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Edward had not kissed her. Not in front of witnesses, not where such a gesture would have required explanation. He had simply taken her hand, holding it for a moment longer than propriety allowed, and in that moment, Eleanor had understood that this was all the ceremony she would receive. This small gesture, this public acknowledgement in a private place, this binding of themselves to each other in the eyes of God and the law, even though the eyes of society would never recognize. The certificate had been signed in the register, Edward's handwriting bold and certain, Eleanor's smaller, her hand trembling slightly as she wrote her name. No longer Hartwell, now Sinclair, though she would never be permitted to use that name in any public context. The vicar had given them the certificate, and Edward had slipped it into his coat pocket, as though it were merely correspondence. I will keep this safe, he had said quietly, and Eleanor had known that he meant it. The journey back to London had been conducted in near silence. They had travelled in separate carriages, arriving at the house hours apart, as though they had come from entirely different places. No one had questioned it. No one had noticed anything amiss. And so Eleanor had returned to being invisible. Edward had returned to being the Duke. And somewhere between them, locked in Edward's private study, in a document that no one would ever see, they had become husband and wife. I should have told you sooner about what my mother said, Edward continued now, in the darkness of Eleanor's small room, bringing Eleanor back to the present. About her suspicions. I should have prepared you for what is coming. What is coming? Eleanor asked quietly. Society's expectations, Edward replied. My mother's patience ending. The pressure to marry someone appropriate, someone whose family connections matter. someone who can give Harrington the kind of life it has always had. The pressure to be what the Duke of Harrington is supposed to be, rather than what he actually is. Eleanor moved away from him and sat on the edge of her bed. And what are you supposed to be? Unattached, available, a prize to be won by the right family. Edward sat beside her, careful to maintain distance. What I actually am is yours, and that is a truth that cannot be reconciled with what society expects. Then we must choose, Eleanor said quietly, between the secret and the truth, between being married-in-law but not in life, or being nothing at all. Or, Edward said, we choose a third option. We choose to stop hiding. Eleanor turned to look at him. Do you understand what that would mean? For me especially, I would be destroyed. They would say I seduced you. They would say I took advantage of your position. They would destroy my reputation beyond any possibility of recovery. I know, Edward said, and I cannot ask you to bear that. But Eleanor, I am asking you to understand that I cannot continue as we are. This silence is killing me, and I suspect it is killing you as well. Eleanor said nothing, because he was right. The silence that had seemed bearable in the first months had become suffocating. Being invisible had become a prison, and the longer they maintained it, the more it felt like Edward was choosing his title over her, his reputation over her, his place in society over her. We do not have to decide tonight, Edward said finally, but we do have to decide, soon. Because Eleanor, I cannot watch my mother arrange a marriage for me to another woman while you exist in this house as a ghost. And I cannot ask you to continue bearing that. He rose to leave, as he always did. Eleanor watched him move toward the door. This man she had married in secret. This man she loved with a completeness that terrified. Edward, she called softly, using his name for perhaps the first time outside of darkness. He turned back. I love you, she said. But I need you to understand that my love is not enough to sustain this forever. At some point you will have to choose, and when that moment comes, I hope you will choose me. Edward stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the faint light from the corridor. I will, he said. I promise you, Eleanor, when the moment comes, I will choose you. But even as he said it, Eleanor wondered if it was a promise he could keep, or if it was simply the desperate hope of a man who had not yet understood that some choices could not be delayed indefinitely. The servants noticed first, as servants always did. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper who had worked in the Harrington household for nearly 20 years, was not a woman given to speculation. She ran the domestic operations with the precision of a military commander, her authority absolute, her standards uncompromising. She did not gossip. She did not concern herself with matters that did not directly affect the functioning of the household. And yet, even she could not fail to notice the patterns that were beginning to emerge. Eleanor had been with them 3 years. In that time, she had been the model of discretion, competent, quiet, unremarkable. She had caused no trouble. She had required no special accommodation. She was precisely the sort of servant a great house required, present when needed, invisible when not. But something had changed. It was subtle. Mrs. Pemberton would not have noticed it if she were not the sort of woman who made it her business to notice everything. Eleanor took her meals alone now, when previously she had sat with the other servants. Eleanor kept to herself in the evenings, when previously she might have engaged in the quiet activities that occupied servants during their free time. And most notably, Eleanor moved through the house with a kind of weariness that suggested she was carrying a weight no one else could see. The girl seems troubled, Mrs. Pemberton remarked to Thomas, the butler, one afternoon as they reviewed the household accounts. Have you noticed? Thomas, a man of perhaps 50, with the careful neutrality of someone who had survived decades in service by minding his own business, looked up from the ledger. Miss Hartwell, I have not noticed anything untoward, ma'am. Not untoward, Mrs. Pemberton clarified. Simply changed, as though something is occupying her mind. Perhaps she is simply homesick, Thomas suggested carefully. 3 years is a long time away from family. Mrs. Pemberton accepted this explanation, though she did not entirely believe it. She had seen enough of life to understand that homesickness did not typically manifest as the kind of careful distance Eleanor had begun to maintain. There was something else there, something that required Eleanor to construct walls around herself. But if the servants noticed Eleanor's changes, they also noticed something far more significant: the Duke's behaviour. It began with the tea service. Every evening, without fail, the Duke requested tea in his study at precisely 9 o'clock. A small thing, routine and unremarkable, except that the Duke never took tea. He was not a man given to such indulgences. Yet now, every evening, Eleanor was dispatched to bring him tea that he never quite seemed to drink, and she would disappear into his study for perhaps 10 minutes, before returning with the untouched cup. One of the younger maids, a girl named Charlotte who had recently joined the household, was the first to voice what everyone was beginning to suspect. "Do you think he fancies her?" she asked one evening in the servants' hall, her voice pitched low enough that it could be denied if overheard. "Do not be ridiculous," another maid, Sarah, replied, with the automatic dismissal of someone repeating what she had been taught. "He is a duke. She is a housemaid. Such things do not happen." "Ah, and yet she goes to his study every evening," Charlotte persisted, "and she is the only servant he ever speaks to directly, and I have seen the way he looks at her when he thinks no one is watching." "You have an overactive imagination," Sarah said, but there was uncertainty in her voice now. Thomas, overhearing this exchange from the corner where he was polishing silver, said nothing, but he made a mental note to speak with Mrs. Pemberton. It was that conversation that prompted the housekeeper to request a private word with Eleanor. They met in Mrs. Pemberton's small office, a room where household matters were managed, staff grievances addressed, and decisions about employment made. Eleanor sat across from the older woman, her hands folded in her lap, her expression carefully composed. "How have you found your employment here, Miss Hartwell?" Mrs. Pemberton asked without preamble. "Satisfactory, ma'am," Eleanor replied. "I have no complaints." "That is not what I asked," Mrs. Pemberton said. She was a woman who preferred directness to dancing around subjects. "I asked how you have found your employment, not whether it is satisfactory, but how it has affected you." Eleanor's carefully maintained composure flickered slightly. "I do not understand the distinction, ma'am." "I think you do," Mrs. Pemberton said. She was not unkind, but she was not gentle either. "You have been with us 3 years, Miss Hartwell. In that time, you have been exemplary. But recently, I have noticed a change. You seem troubled, distracted, as though you are carrying some burden that prevents you from being entirely present." Eleanor said nothing. "I have also noticed," Mrs. Pemberton continued, "that the Duke's behaviour toward you has changed. The tea service, for instance. The Duke does not take tea, and yet he requests it every evening, always requesting you specifically to deliver it. These are patterns, Miss Hartwell, and patterns are what allow me to understand what is occurring in my household." "Nothing is occurring," Eleanor said quietly. "I hope that is true," Mrs. Pemberton replied, "because if something were occurring, if there were any impropriety between you and the Duke, I would have no choice but to dismiss you. Such a thing would be impossible in a household of this standing. It would be impossible for you to remain, and it would be impossible for him to maintain his position without considerable scandal." Eleanor's hands clenched in her lap. "There is no impropriety, ma'am. I believe you," Mrs. Pemberton said, and she sounded as though she meant it. "But I am warning you nonetheless. Whatever feelings might exist between you and the Duke, and I am not blind to the possibility that feelings might exist, they must be contained. They must not become visible, because if they do, the consequences for you would be severe. And I suspect you are aware of this." Eleanor met the older woman's gaze. "I am aware." "Good," Mrs. Pemberton said. "Then I trust we will not need to have this conversation again. You may return to your duties." Eleanor left the office, her heart racing. Mrs. Pemberton had not dismissed her, but the warning had been clear. The invisibility that had protected them was beginning to fracture. People were noticing. People were speculating. And the more people noticed, the more dangerous the situation became. Meanwhile, in the drawing room of Belgrave Square, a different kind of pressure was building. The Dowager Duchess, Edward's mother, was a woman of 63 who had spent her entire life understanding and manipulating the rules of society. She had married appropriately, produced an heir, and maintained her standing through decades of careful management and strategic alliances. She was not a woman easily moved, and she was not a woman who accepted challenges to her authority. She had begun to notice things about her son. Edward had always been reserved, but his reserve had taken on a new quality. He seemed distracted during dinner. He would sit for long periods staring out windows. When she spoke to him about household matters or social engagements, he responded with the words required, but without the attention such matters deserved. And most troubling of all, He had begun to resist her increasingly direct attempts to arrange a suitable marriage. The Countess of Ashworth mentioned that her daughter will be in town for the season, the Dowager Duchess said one morning as they took breakfast together. Lady Catherine is accomplished, well-bred, from an excellent family. I thought perhaps we might invite them to dinner. That is not necessary, mother, Edward replied without looking up from his correspondence. I did not ask whether it was necessary, Edward. I suggested it as a matter of social propriety. Your father married at 30. I do not believe it unreasonable to expect the same of you. Father married because you insisted upon it, Edward said quietly. I have no intention of following that example. The Dowager Duchess set down her teacup with deliberate precision. You have a responsibility to this family, Edward, to this title, to the legacy that has been entrusted to you. That responsibility includes marrying a woman of appropriate standing and producing an heir. These are not matters of personal preference. They are matters of duty. I am aware of my duties, Edward replied, but I will not sacrifice my entire life to them. You will not be sacrificing anything, his mother said coldly. You will be fulfilling what is expected of you, as all of us do. Edward finally looked up from his correspondence, and there was something in his expression that made the Dowager Duchess pause. And what if what is expected of me is contrary to what I actually need? Then you will set aside what you need and do what is required, the Dowager Duchess said. That is what duty demands. That is what has always been demanded. She rose from the table, her posture rigid, her expression unforgiving. I trust, Edward, that you will not force me to involve myself in this matter more directly. A son who defies his mother's counsel becomes a son who no longer has a mother's support. I hope you understand the implications of that. It was not precisely a threat, but it was certainly close enough. Edward understood perfectly. His mother's support, her approval, her presence in his life, her acceptance of him as her son, was contingent upon his compliance with her expectations. Defy her, and he would lose not only his standing in society, but also his family itself. That evening, Eleanor did not unlock the door when Edward came to her room. He knocked, once, twice, the pattern they had established, but the door remained closed. Eleanor, please, he said softly, his voice barely audible through the wood. Let me in. Eleanor sat on her bed, her arms wrapped around herself, and said nothing. I know Mrs. Pemberton spoke with you, he continued. I know she has threatened your position. I know you are frightened. But Eleanor, we cannot let fear dictate what we do. We have no choice, Eleanor said, her voice muffled through the door. We have always had no choice. This was always how it would end. This is not the end, Edward said, and now there was an edge of desperation to his voice. Eleanor, I will not accept that this is the end. I will find a way. There is no way. Eleanor opened the door then, her face flushed with tears and anger. Do you understand that? There is no way that does not end in my destruction or yours or both. We are not living in a world that permits what we are trying to do. Edward reached for her, but she stepped back. Do not touch me, Edward. If you touch me, if you convince me again that this is survivable, I will believe you, and I cannot afford to believe you anymore. Eleanor, your mother is pressuring you to marry, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. The servants are beginning to suspect something. We cannot continue as we are, and you know it. You have always known it. Then we run away, Edward said, the words tumbling out with the desperation of someone grasping at straws. We leave London. We go somewhere no one knows us. We build a life together openly. With what resources? Eleanor interrupted. With what standing? We would be pariahs everywhere. You would lose your title, your family, your fortune, and I would still be the woman who seduced the Duke, still be destroyed by society's judgment. I do not care about society's judgment, Edward said fiercely. But I do, Eleanor replied, because I have spent my entire life being invisible, Edward. The thought of becoming visible only to be reviled. I cannot bear it. I cannot be strong enough for both of us. Edward stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. He took Eleanor's face in his hands, forcing her to meet his gaze. Listen to me. I love you. I married you. I will not let you disappear again. Not into silence, not into invisibility, not ever again. That is not something you need to be strong enough for. That is something I will do for both of us. How? Eleanor whispered. How will you do that? Edward drew her close, holding her against his chest. I do not know yet. But Eleanor, I promise you, I will find a way. Even if it destroys me, even if it means losing everything, I will find a way to claim you openly. I will not let this end in silence. Eleanor wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that love could somehow overcome the impossible weight of society's expectations. But she had spent too many years learning how the world worked, learning that some things could not be overcome through love alone. I need time, she said finally. I need time to think. You have it, Edward said. But Eleanor, do not take so much time that the world decides for us, because if that happens, if my mother or society or circumstance forces my hand, then the choice will no longer be ours to make. He left her then, slipping back through the darkened corridors to his own chambers, and Eleanor was alone with the terrible knowledge that Edward was right. Time was running out, and when it finally did run out, they would have to make a choice neither of them was truly prepared to make. 3 weeks passed in a state of careful distance. Eleanor and Edward maintained the necessary formalities during daylight hours. She brought his tea. He acknowledged her with appropriate indifference. No one observing them would have detected anything beyond the standard interaction between an employer and a servant. But the careful distance was a different kind of pain than the secrecy had been. It was the pain of proximity without connection, of being in the same room and unable to acknowledge each other, of living in a state of perpetual denial. Meanwhile, pressure accumulated from all directions. The Dowager Duchess sent formal invitations to a series of dinner parties, each of which included a different eligible young woman. Lady Catherine made multiple appearances, always placed strategically near Edward during the meal, always invited to participate in the activities afterward. The message was clear. A choice was being made for him, and if he did not make one himself, one would be made on his behalf. Mrs. Pemberton's warning had also had its intended effect. Other servants had been subtly reassigned. Eleanor was no longer assigned to Edward's private chambers during the day. Someone else brought the tea now, a younger maid who was efficient and entirely forgettable. Eleanor was relegated to the public rooms, kept visible but kept distant, a clear signal that the household had decided to enforce the boundaries Eleanor and Edward had allowed to blur. And then came the letter. It arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by courier to Edward's study. His solicitor had written to inform him that there was a matter of considerable importance requiring his immediate attention, a property matter, something that could not be discussed in correspondence. Could the Duke come to the offices in London the following day? Edward read the letter twice, then a third time, trying to understand why his solicitor would send such a summons for something that could presumably be handled through normal channels. Then, in the margin of the letter, he noticed the small notation. Written in his solicitor's hand were the words, "Family matter of urgency." That night, Edward went to Eleanor's room. She was sitting by the window when he entered, not moving to greet him. They had maintained such distance for 3 weeks that his presence seemed almost alien in the small space. "My solicitor has summoned me," Edward said without preamble. "Tomorrow. I do not know what it concerns, but I suspect my mother is behind it." Eleanor turned to look at him. "What will you do?" "Go, obviously. Find out what crisis she has manufactured." Edward paced the small room, his agitation apparent. "But Eleanor, I need you to understand something. I cannot continue as we have been. This distance, this pretense, this slow erasure of what we are to each other. I cannot bear it anymore." "What are you saying?" Eleanor asked quietly. "I am saying that when I return, things must change. I will not return to this existence." Edward turned to face her. "I have been thinking about what you said, about the impossibility of our situation, and I have been trying to imagine alternatives, ways that we might somehow navigate this without complete destruction. But Eleanor, I have come to realize that there is no middle ground. There is no way to have this both ways." "Then what do you propose?" Eleanor asked, though she thought she already knew. "I propose that we choose ourselves," Edward said, "that we stop allowing society and my mother and duty and propriety to dictate what we are permitted to do, that we claim each other openly and accept whatever consequences follow." "You will lose your title," Eleanor said quietly. "Perhaps. Your fortune. Perhaps. Or perhaps not. I have spoken with my solicitor about such matters. They are complex, but not entirely impossible to manage. Your family." "Yes," Edward said, and there was genuine pain in his voice. "I will likely lose my mother's support. That is a consequence I understand and have accepted." Eleanor stood, moving closer to him. "And what of me, Edward? What of the woman society will label as the seductress who brought down the Duke of Harrington? The servant who used her position to trap a man into marriage? That is what they will say. Do you understand? That is what I will become. Yes, Edward said, and I cannot ask you to bear that. But Eleanor, I am asking you to consider whether bearing it together might be preferable to this slow death in silence. Eleanor looked at this man she had married in secret, this man who had promised to protect her and had instead kept her locked away. If you do this, you must be certain, completely certain, because once you make this choice, there is no taking it back. There is no returning to the way things were. I know, Edward said, and that is precisely why I am choosing to do it. Edward's meeting with his solicitor the following day was unlike anything he had anticipated. He arrived at the offices in the city expecting to find his solicitor, Mr. Worthington, waiting with documents about some property concern. Instead, he found himself face to face with his mother. The Dowager Duchess was seated in Mr. Worthington's study, her posture regal, her expression carefully composed. Mr. Worthington himself was absent, clearly having been asked to excuse himself from the proceedings. "Mother," Edward said carefully, "I was not expecting—" "I am certain you were not," the Dowager Duchess interrupted. "I took the liberty of using your solicitor's services to arrange this meeting. I felt it was time we had a conversation that could not be interrupted by household staff or circumstance." Edward sat across from her, preparing himself for whatever confrontation was to come. "What is this about?" "It is about your future," the Dowager Duchess said. "Or rather, about your refusal to secure one. Edward, I have watched you resist every reasonable suggestion regarding marriage. I have watched you become increasingly distant from society, and I have watched you develop what I can only describe as an inappropriate attachment to a member of the household staff." Edward's entire body went rigid. "I do not know what you are referring to." "Do not insult my intelligence," his mother said coldly. "I have known you for 32 years, Edward. I understand your patterns. I understand the way you move through the world. And I understand that you have become entangled with Miss Hartwell in a manner that is entirely unacceptable." Edward said nothing because any response would be an admission of what he had been trying to hide. "I have made inquiries," the Dowager Duchess continued. "Discreet inquiries, of course. Miss Hartwell is a capable servant, that much is clear. But she is also a woman of no family, no connections, no fortune. She is entirely unsuitable in every conceivable way. And yet you have chosen to, what shall I call it, develop feelings for her, spend time with her. I find myself uncertain of the precise nature of your transgression." "There is no transgression," Edward said quietly. "Then explain to me why a servant is the primary recipient of your attention. Explain to me why you request her specifically for tasks. Explain to me why Thomas has reported seeing you in conversation with her in corridors, when you believe no one is watching." Edward felt the walls closing in. His mother had been methodical in her observation. She had gathered evidence. She had built a case. "I care for Miss Hartwell," Edward said finally, deciding that some honesty was better than complete denial. "I respect her competence and her character. Is that a crime?" "It is a foolishness," his mother replied. "And it is a foolishness I will not permit to continue. I am giving you two options, Edward. Option 1. You agree to court Lady Catherine formally. You announce an engagement within the month. You marry her within the season. In exchange, I will allow Miss Hartwell to remain in the household, provided that you cease any inappropriate contact with her. She will be transferred to another area of the house, and you will maintain strictly professional distance." Edward felt something inside him break at the thought of being forced to marry while Eleanor remained in the house, invisible and unreachable. "And option 2, he asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Option 2. You continue in this foolish path. You refuse to marry appropriately. You persist in this attachment to the servant, in which case, I will have no choice but to dismiss Miss Hartwell from the household immediately, and you will be cut off entirely from my support and approval. You will be denied access to the family estates. You will find yourself considerably less wealthy than you currently imagine, because much of your income comes through trusts I manage, and you will find yourself entirely alone in society, cast out by the very people who currently accept you." The Dowager Duchess rose from her chair, her posture rigid with the righteousness of someone who believed herself to be acting in another's best interest. "I am doing this for you, Edward. I am preventing you from making a catastrophic error. Miss Hartwell is not worthy of you. No woman of her station ever could be. And allowing yourself to imagine otherwise is nothing more than weakness and delusion. You do not understand, Edward said quietly. No, his mother agreed. I do not understand. But I do not need to understand. I need only to ensure that you do not destroy yourself through sentiment and foolishness. You have until Monday to give me your answer. Engagement or exile. Those are your choices. She left him there in Mr. Worthington's office, surrounded by the weight of an impossible decision. Edward did not return to Belgrave Square immediately. Instead, he walked through London's streets, his mind racing, trying to find some solution that did not require him to choose between his life and Eleanor's safety. He could marry Lady Catherine. It would be a marriage of convenience, certainly, but such marriages existed throughout society. He could maintain his position, his fortune, his family, and Eleanor could remain in the household, where he could see her, though he would be bound by marriage to another woman. But even as he considered this option, he knew he could not do it. The thought of being married to Catherine while Eleanor existed in the same house, invisible and untouchable, was a torture he could not inflict upon himself. And more importantly, it was a betrayal of Eleanor that he could not justify. The other option was exile. He would lose his mother's support. He would be cut off from a significant portion of his income. He would become a pariah to society, but he would have Eleanor. He could claim her openly. They could build some kind of life together, diminished though it might be. By the time Edward returned to Belgrave Square, the decision had already been made for him. Eleanor was gone. A note was waiting for him in his study, written in Eleanor's careful hand. Edward, I have been dismissed from the household. Mrs. Pemberton informed me this evening that my services are no longer required, effective immediately. I am to leave by morning. I do not know how your mother discovered our attachment, but it is clear that she has. And I understand now that there is no path forward that does not require you to choose between me and everything else. I cannot ask you to make that choice. I cannot be the reason you lose your family, your position, your future. I am leaving London. I have secured a position with a family in the country, a temporary arrangement, but it will suffice for now. By the time you read this, I will already be gone. I need you to understand that I am not leaving because I do not love you. I am leaving because I do love you, and that love requires me to protect you, even if it means protecting you from yourself. If, in the future, you find that you can accept a life without title and without fortune, then perhaps we might find each other again. But I will not be the woman who destroyed you. I will not be the reason you became an exile. Burn this letter. Edward read the letter 3 times, then sank into his chair as though all strength had been drained from his body. Eleanor had made the choice for him. She had removed herself from the equation, leaving him with the path of least resistance. Accept his mother's terms, marry Lady Catherine, maintain his position. She had handed him back his life at the cost of losing her from. It would have been easy to accept her sacrifice. It would have been easy to marry Catherine, to maintain his standing, to tell himself that what he had with Eleanor had been a beautiful dream that circumstance had rendered impossible. But Edward had not spent weeks in silence without learning something crucial. He had learned that some things mattered more than comfort, some things mattered more than family, some things mattered more than title or fortune or social standing, and Eleanor mattered more than all of those things combined. He rose from his chair and moved to the desk. He wrote 2 letters with the same pen Eleanor had used to write hers. The first was to his mother. Mother, I have made my decision. I cannot accept the terms you have offered. I will not marry Lady Catherine. I will not abandon the woman I love to preserve my position. I am aware of the consequences. I understand that you will withdraw your support. I accept the loss of income that will result. I am prepared to live as a man without title if that is what is required. But I will not live as a man without Eleanor. I will not accept a life built upon her sacrifice and invisibility. If you are willing to accept this, then I remain your son. If you cannot accept it, then I understand that our relationship is at an end. Either way, my course is set. Edward. The second letter was to Eleanor, though he had no address to send it to. He left it with the instruction that it be held until she contacted the household. Eleanor, you are not permitted to make this choice for me. You are not permitted to disappear and ask me to move forward without you. I will not accept it. I am leaving London to find you. I will search for you if I must, and when I find you, I am going to ask you to marry me again, this time openly, in front of witnesses, with no hiding and no shame. I do not care if society condemns us. I do not care if my mother disowns me. I do not care if I lose everything except you, because everything else is meaningless. Wait for me, Eleanor. Please wait for me, because I am coming to claim you, and I will not accept refusal. Edward Perfect. Let me continue with section 5. The revelation, the search, and the public choice that changes everything. Edward did not wait for Monday's deadline with his mother. He did not wait for the household to settle into routine. He did not wait for anything. Within hours of discovering Eleanor's letter, he had instructed his solicitor to begin making inquiries. A woman of her description, recently hired, seeking work in the country. He sent letters to families he knew, using his connections to trace her movements. He hired investigators. He did what any man with resources and desperation would do. He began to systematically search for the woman who had disappeared from his life. It took 4 days. Eleanor had secured a position with the Ashworth family, whose country estate was located in Oxfordshire, nearly 80 miles from London. They had hired her as a lady's maid to the Countess, who apparently did not care about references or background, only that the woman was competent and quiet. Eleanor had become what she had always been: invisible, useful, unremarkable. Edward arrived at the Ashworth estate on a Friday afternoon, travel-worn and exhausted. He did not send word ahead. He did not request an audience. He simply appeared at the door and announced to the butler that he required a word with the Dowager Duchess of Harrington's former housemaid. The butler, confused but trained to accommodate the requests of a duke, showed him to the morning room to wait. Eleanor was fetching fresh linens when she was summoned. She recognized immediately what his presence meant. Not catastrophe, but choice. The kind of choice that could no longer be avoided. She found him standing by the window, his clothes dusty from travel, his expression exhausted but resolved. When he turned and saw her, something broke open in his face. The careful control he had maintained abandoned in favor of raw relief. "You came," Eleanor said quietly. "Of course I came," Edward replied. "Did you imagine I would simply accept your sacrifice and move forward without you? Eleanor, you do not understand what you mean to me. You do not understand that losing you is not a manageable consequence I can simply bear. It is the destruction of everything that matters." "Edward, you cannot be here," Eleanor said, looking toward the doorway. "If anyone sees—" "I do not care who sees," Edward said, and he crossed the room and took her face in his hands, exactly as he had done in her small room at Belgrave Square. "I do not care anymore, Eleanor. I have spent months caring what people think, what society expects, what my mother demands, and in doing so, I have lost you. I will not do it again." "What have you done?" Eleanor whispered. "I have refused my mother's ultimatum," Edward said. "I have chosen you. I am choosing you now, in front of God and myself, and I am about to choose you in front of all of society as well." "Edward, you cannot." "I am going to return to London," he continued, his voice steady and certain. "I am going to announce that I am married. I am going to provide the certificate from our chapel. I am going to tell society exactly who my wife is and precisely how long I have known her. And I am going to do it with such certainty and such love in my voice that when people whisper about scandal, they will be whispering about the fact that they had the audacity to question what I know to be true." Eleanor pulled away from him, her heart racing. "You will be ruined." "Probably," Edward agreed. "My mother will withdraw her support. Certain families will close their doors to us. I may very well lose a significant portion of my income, but Eleanor, I will not lose you, and everything else is secondary to that." "I cannot let you do this," Eleanor said. "I cannot be responsible for your destruction." "You are not responsible," Edward said. "I am. This is my choice, and I take full responsibility for it. But Eleanor, I need you to understand something. I need you to understand that this will only work if you choose me as well. If you accept what I am doing, if you stand beside me, if you claim your position as my wife openly and without shame. Can you do that?" Eleanor looked at this man who had searched for her, who had travelled 80 miles to find her, who was willing to sacrifice his entire world for her. She thought about the months of invisibility, the silence that had nearly destroyed them both, the weight of being unseen. "Yes," she said finally. "Yes, I can do that. Edward pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she might disappear again. Then we returned to London together. We faced this together, and we do not apologize for what we are. The announcement was made on a Tuesday morning. Edward sent a letter to the major newspapers. He sent notifications to every family of consequence in his acquaintance. He instructed his solicitor to ensure that the marriage certificate was visible to anyone who wished to verify it. And then, on that Tuesday morning, he walked into Parliament and made a statement that would echo through London society for months to come. He had married, he announced, 6 months prior, legally and honourably. The certificate was available for verification. He had kept the marriage secret because he understood society's expectations, because he had hoped to protect both himself and his wife from judgment. But he was no longer willing to live in silence or shame for loving someone he respected and valued completely. The reaction was immediate and savage. Whispers turned to accusations. Speculation became certainty. Within hours, the story had spread through London's drawing rooms. The Duke had married a servant. The Duke had been seduced by a woman of no standing. The Duke had made himself ridiculous through passion and poor judgment. The Dowager Duchess cut him off entirely. Her solicitors drew up documents withdrawing her support, reducing his access to family funds, making clear that if he proceeded with this path, he would do so without her assistance or approval. She did not respond to his letters. She did not acknowledge him at dinner parties. She simply erased him from her life with the efficiency of someone who had perfected the art of severance. But there were others who did not condemn him. A letter arrived from a distant cousin, a woman who had married beneath her station and had been quietly ostracized for it. Welcome to the ranks of those who chose love over propriety. It is smaller company but infinitely better. Another came from a baron whose own marriage had caused scandal years prior. Society's judgment is temporary, but its memory is mercifully short. Hold steady. The storm will pass. And most surprisingly, one arrived from the elderly Duchess of Cornwall, a woman who had known Edward's father. Your father married your mother because it was expected. He spent his entire life wondering what it might have felt like to choose his own heart. Do not make his mistake. You have chosen correctly. Eleanor's return to London was managed with the same deliberate publicity that Edward had used for his announcement. She arrived at Belgrave Square not through the servants' entrance, but through the front door on Edward's arm. She was dressed in a travelling gown that was modest but clearly expensive, that spoke of wealth and position rather than service. She held her head high as servants and staff stared at her passage through the halls. Mrs. Pemberton, witnessing the scene, simply turned and walked away. Some betrayals ran too deep to process immediately. Eleanor was installed not in the servants' quarters, but in the Duchess's chambers, the rooms that had belonged to the Dowager Duchess before she withdrew from the household entirely. It was a deliberate statement. Eleanor Sinclair, the Duke's wife, was claiming her position. The scandal reached its peak at a ball given by the Countess of Ashford. It was perhaps the most significant social gathering of the season, and Edward and Eleanor had every expectation of being denied entry. Instead, they arrived together, announced formally, and watched the reaction of the assembled crowd. Conversations stopped. Women turned to each other with expressions of shock. Men stared. The Countess herself looked genuinely uncertain about how to proceed. Edward guided Eleanor toward the ballroom, his hand resting on her arm with the certainty of a man claiming what belonged to him. Several families deliberately avoided them. Several conversations ended abruptly as they approached. But there were also people who greeted them, who acknowledged Eleanor with civility, who demonstrated through their actions that while the scandal might be real, society's judgment was not uniformly damning. And then Lord Harrow, a man of considerable standing whose own marriage had been unorthodox, approached them directly. I heard the announcement, he said to Edward, extending his hand. Congratulations, Sinclair. It takes courage to defy society's expectations. I respect it. The gesture was small, but it was significant. It gave permission, in a way, for others to acknowledge Edward and Eleanor without fear of contamination. If Lord Harrow accepted them, then perhaps they were not entirely beyond the pale. The evening was not a triumph in the conventional sense. There were still whispers, there were still people who refused to acknowledge Eleanor, but there was also acceptance, grudging though it might be, from enough people to suggest that survival was possible. When the evening ended, Eleanor was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion, and everything to do with the sheer effort of existing visibly in a world that had deemed her unworthy of visibility. "You were magnificent," Edward told her as they returned to Belgrave Square in his carriage. "I was terrified," Eleanor corrected. "Yes," Edward agreed, "but you were magnificent nonetheless. You stood beside me. You claimed your position. You refused to be ashamed. That is more than most people could do." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder. "What happens now?" "Now," Edward said, "we live, visibly, openly, without apology. We accept that some people will never forgive us, that some doors will remain closed to us, but we also accept that we have each other, and that is enough." The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of triumph and reckoning. Some doors did indeed close. Certain families withdrew invitations. The Dowager Duchess remained implacably hostile, refusing even to acknowledge Eleanor's existence when forced to move in the same circles. The scandal became the topic of every drawing-room conversation, analysed and dissected and speculated upon. But other things happened as well. Eleanor discovered that she had unexpected allies among women who had themselves faced judgment for one transgression or another. The Countess of Ashford, moved by Eleanor's courage, began inviting her to smaller gatherings. A widow of considerable standing took Eleanor under her wing, introducing her to women who valued substance over pedigree. Eleanor's intelligence and grace, once hidden beneath the uniform of a servant, became apparent to everyone who actually spoke with her. Edward, for his part, found himself no longer able to claim the comfortable position of a man of unblemished reputation. But he also found that losing that position freed him from the necessity of maintaining it. He began to speak in Parliament about social reform, about the arbitrary nature of class distinctions, about the ways in which society's rigid structures prevented talented people from advancing based on merit rather than birth. Some of his colleagues mocked him. Some suggested that his speeches were born of sentiment rather than reason, but others listened, and slowly, incrementally, the conversation began to shift. 3 months after the public announcement, Eleanor found herself attending a dinner party as the Duke's wife, seated beside a countess, engaging in conversation about literature and art with the same confidence that a woman of her new position ought to possess. The countess asked her opinion, and Eleanor gave it thoughtfully, without apology or diminishment. "You are quite remarkable, Your Grace," the Countess said after. "I confess I was sceptical when I heard the gossip, but now that I have met you, I find I cannot understand the objection." "The objection is simply that I was not born to this," Eleanor replied. "Society prefers that such circumstances be arranged at birth rather than earned through choices made afterward." "Perhaps," the Countess said, "but I have known many women born to this position who possessed neither your intelligence nor your grace. I think society may need to reconsider some of its assumptions." 6 months after the announcement, the Dowager Duchess requested a meeting with Edward. They met in his study, a space that felt charged with tension despite its familiarity. The Dowager Duchess looked older than Edward remembered, her posture still regal, but her face bearing the lines of a woman who had been engaged in a prolonged and exhausting battle. "I have come to understand that your marriage is not merely a temporary madness," she said without preamble. "It appears to be an actual commitment." "It is," Edward replied, "and you do not intend to rectify the situation." "There is no situation to rectify, Mother. I am married. I am happy. I wish you to accept this." The Dowager Duchess was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I have been made aware that your wife is not without merit. I have heard from multiple sources that she is intelligent, gracious, and has conducted herself with dignity despite the scandalous circumstances. I have also been informed that you have been using your position in Parliament to advocate for reforms that might actually benefit society, a pursuit you had never previously demonstrated interest in." "She inspires me to be better," Edward said simply. "I suspect she does," his mother replied. "Your father never had that. He never found a woman who made him want to be more than what society had already determined he should be. I wonder sometimes what he might have become if he had." She rose, preparing to leave. Before she reached the door, she turned back. "I will not apologize for my opposition, Edward. I believe I was acting in what I thought were your best interests. But I can acknowledge that I was wrong. If you can accept that acknowledgement, then perhaps we might find our way back to some form of understanding." "I can accept that," Edward said. The Dowager Duchess nodded, and there was something like forgiveness in her expression. "I should like to take tea with your wife, not as a concession, but as a step toward understanding, if she would be willing." "I believe she would," Edward said. That tea became a weekly ritual. The Dowager Duchess and Eleanor would sit in the drawing room while servants brought fresh cups and delicate pastries, and they would talk. It was not an easy reconciliation. There were moments when old tensions surfaced, but there was also genuine effort on both sides to move past the initial conflict towards something that might eventually resemble acceptance. 1 year after the public announcement, Eleanor stood in the garden at Belgrave Square, watching the spring flowers bloom with the same vitality that had characterized her from the beginning. Edward found her there, as he often did in these quiet moments before the day's obligations began. "What are you thinking?" he asked, taking her hand. "I am thinking about invisibility," Eleanor replied. "About how I spent so many years learning to disappear, learning to make myself small and unremarkable, and how it took you to teach me that being seen, truly seen, was worth any cost." "You were always remarkable," Edward said. "Society simply did not have the eyes to perceive it." "Perhaps," Eleanor said, "but I did not have the courage to demand to be seen. That took you." Edward pulled her close, and they stood together in the garden, no longer hiding, no longer afraid. The world still whispered about them. There were still people who would never fully accept their marriage, but they had built something that transcended society's judgment. They had built a life together where love was not shameful, where choices were honored even when they defied expectation, where two people could claim each other openly and without apology. Eleanor was no longer the Duke's maid in public and his wife in secret. She was simply the Duchess of Harrington, a woman who had been seen